Welcome back, all. Continuing Hilchot Shabbat, Siman Shin Yud Chet 318, dealing with Hilchot Bishul. We are up to Seif Vav. We've learned the first five Seifim over the last few weeks. We have seen so far in Seif Aleph the consequences of a person who desecrates Shabbat, either intentionally or unintentionally. Seif Bet was when you need to do melacha for someone who is ill, with the life-threatening situation, whether you can benefit from the result of that melacha. And then that was just general points of all melachot. And Sif Gimel dealt with cooking in the sun and something which has been heated by the sun. We talked in that context of the microwave and a boiler, dut shemesh. Sif Dalad was the major Sif in which we discussed many different mahlokot. I'm not going to go over them now, but many different points we discussed in Sif Dalad, and we finished off, and we discussed last week the whole concept of Kli Sheni, Kli Rishon, Kli Shlishi, the Ashkenazim, the Sfaradim, and the concept of Kalei HaBishul, things which are easy to be cooked. And then what we focused on last week was Seif Hey, where we had this major mahloket in the Rishonim with regards to, is there a concept of baking after cooking or vice versa, Bishula Harafiyah? And we saw the two opinions, and the opinion of Hamavadia was that the main opinion is the second one, which is the majority opinion, which is that there is no concept of cooking after baking or vice versa. Although some other poskim, definitely the Ashkenazi poskim, are mahmir in the first instance to consider bishula harafiyah. And in that context, we talked about how to make coffee, Nescafe, tea leaves, tea bags, and so on and so forth. So that can all be heard. If you missed that, you can listen back to the recordings, but that's all there. All those details are all there, and that ties in with Sif Dalet and Hey. Tonight, we're going to cover quite a lot of ground, Bezrat Hashem, because they're smaller seifim. I want to try to get towards the end of the Siman. We're going to skip out two seifim, which are a major topic, which we'll do next week in one batch, in one go. Need a whole shiur for that. But so we're going to do is all the small points, Sivav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, and then go to Yud Gimel, Yud Daled, Tet Vav, and maybe Tet Zayin. Okay, and then next week we'll do the two big seifim, Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, and then finish off Hilchot Bishul in time for Pesach. So we are now beginning Shin Yud Chet, Seif Vav. Here is the link in the chat. Okay, these are relatively straightforward things, so we're going to go quite fast through it. Vav. Kli sheyesh bo davar ham shayat soledet bo. So he's talking about a liquid here. Remember, we've said that Shulchan Aruch holds that with liquids, it's subject to further bishul. So even if you already cooked something, if it's cooled down, it's subject to further bishul, and it has to still be yad soledet bo. Let's just actually stop for a moment. I've been saying all the time we'll come and talk about yad soledet bo, but I haven't actually done this. Let's stop for a moment and actually discuss what is yad soledet bo, something which we've been mentioning throughout over the past few weeks. So the concept of yad soledet bo is found in the Gemara. Yad soledet bo means your hand is scalded with it. That's the temperature of bishul. Your hand can be scalded. Now the Gemara gives another definition aside from that, is kreso shel tinok nichvet, which means the stomach of a baby is burnt. So there's a difference between burning and scalding. An adult, the temperature is a temperature which can scald your finger or whatever part of your body you put into the hot water. And the equivalent temperature is a temperature where the stomach of a child, which is more tender, can be burnt by it. Now, what does that mean? How are we to measure what that is? Do we go and put our fingers in and see whether you get burnt or not? This is the most important thing to know in bishul, because everything is, if it's under yad soledet ba, there's no bishul. If it's over yad soledet ba, normally there is bishul. Normally, not always, but normally there is. So how do we define the concept of your hand being scalded or the stomach of a child being burnt? So the Ben Ish Chai comes up with an idea, which is a relatively new idea, but the poskim seem to have taken this on. And he says that anything which a person would refrain from eating or drinking it because it's too hot, that's yad soledet bo. Anything which a person would eat and would drink is not yad soledet bo. That's the defining factor. Okay, would you eat it and drink it? So even if you think of a boiling hot tea, yeah, you just made a boiling hot tea, and you don't drink that straight away. You may sip it. Yeah, you're not going to eat or drink that. And that's considered yad soledet bo. But if it's easily edible, easily you can be drank, then that's considered not yad soledet bo. That's his own idea, and how Vadah takes on, and many other poskim take this on, and in practice, it's difficult to say what exactly that is, but that's one way to be able to ascertain what is Yad Soledet Bo. Are you able to drink this freely and eat this freely? If yes, it's no Yad Soledet Bo. If not, then it's probably still Yad Soledet Bo. That's one way of understanding it. The Gemara also, there's another Gemara in Cholin which says that Chom Bet HaShechita Tzonen. Yeah, meaning the place where you slaughter the animal, that still has a status of tzonen. It has ramifications for kashrut. It's still considered cold, even though it's got body temperature of the animal, it's relatively hot. That's still considered tzonen cold. It's not considered hot. It's not considered yad soledet bo. So that temperature is certainly not yad soledet bo. That temperature is purportedly around 40 to 45 degrees. Which is why many of the poskim give a definitive ruling of 45 degrees. Ibn Zalman Auerbach took on 45 degrees. Halvadia seems to take on 45 degrees, although he does quote Chacham Ben Sion, who says 40 degrees. It's quite difficult to accept that. Nowadays, you go to the mikvaot, right? You go the temperature. You can see the temperatures they have in the mikveh in Golders Green. It's got the temperature next to it. It's often 43 degrees, and people freely going in, staying some time there. Okay, so if they're hanging around in such hot water, that's 43 degrees. I don't know how one can say that 40 degrees is Yad Soledet Bo. So Rabbi Falk, I once heard Rabbi Falk in Shul many years ago in Gateshead, he said, yeah, that's not a proof though, because our bodies have changed. Because we have heating, and because we're more exposed to hot things, our bodies have changed. So now we are able to resist heat, and therefore our resistance has gone up. Maybe that's an interesting idea. But like I say, the majority of the poskim take on 45 degrees is considered that's the majority, that's the minimum temperature. Meaning if it's less than 45 degrees, I don't think one needs to be concerned that it may be at Soledet Bo, it may have the ability to do Bishur on Shabbat. From 45 degrees, we assume that perhaps it's Yad Soledet Bo, and therefore one has to take on, there has the potential to cook. But that doesn't mean that 45 degrees is Yad Soledet Bo. And why is that important? Because like we've been learning the last few weeks, that liquids are subject to further bishul. And if liquids are subject to further bishul, that means you can only reheat it if it's still hot, if it's still Yad Soledet Bo. But what is Yad Soledet Bo? We said 45 degrees. No. We're not saying 45 degrees is the temperature. We're saying it's the minimum temperature. It's possible to go all the way through till about 71 degrees. That's what Moshe Feinstein writes, till 71 degrees. So that's the maximum. He says it can't be more than that. Maybe it's less than that. It's somewhere in between 45 to 71. And therefore, for the purposes of relying on en bishul har bishul, for reheating hot liquids, that you have to take on is the highest possibility, which is 71 degrees. But for the purposes of saying that perhaps you can put something in hot water because it's no longer hot, that we would say even from 45 degrees, it still potentially has the ability to cook, and therefore, even putting in 45 degrees is considered potentially bishul. So therefore, to summarize, Yad Soledet Bo is defined in the Gemara as two things. Your hand is scalded or stomach of a child is burnt. The Ben Ish Chai gives the practical way of understanding that, because on Shabbat, how are you going to measure 45 degrees? It's hard. So the Ben Ish Chai gives a very practical thing, and many rely on this. If you can eat and drink it freely, it's fine. If you can't, then it's potentially still Yad Soledet Bo. Theoretically, what that means in degrees is somewhere between 45 to 71 degrees, not going to be more than 71 degrees. Therefore, if liquids is still boiling hot, piping hot, it's 80 degrees, that can be reheated on the hot plate because that's still considered Yad Soledet Bo, and therefore not subject to further bishul because it's still boiling according to the Shulchan Aruch. That's fine. If it's dropped that, it's still very hot, but it's maybe 50, 60 degrees, then one would have to be strict and say that perhaps it's no longer Yatsorezbo, perhaps 71 degrees is the measurement, and therefore less than 71 is no longer considered boiling hot. And therefore, you then have to assume that subject to further bishul, you won't be able to reheat that liquid. Okay? So that's important. Those are the definitions to have in mind when we talk about Yad Soledet. What are we talking about? Theoretically and practically. For all practical purposes on Shabbat, I think we can do the Ben Ish Chai, and when we if we have to sip something like a boiling hot tea, that's still Yad Soledet Bo. If not, then that's fine, and that's not subject to bishul. Okay. So now coming back to Seivav. Kli sheyesh bo davar ham sheyat soledet bo, a utensil which has hot liquid in it, which is still piping hot. He's talking about liquid here. מותר להניחו בשבת על גבי קדרה התמונה כדי שישמור חומו ולא יצטנן. So he's going into slightly different topic, both bishul and also hatmana. So what he's telling us here is that you have liquid, you have hot soup, okay? You've taken off the fire. That fire is not garuf katum, it's not covered. Remember, we've learned in the past that if you can't put food, even fully cooked, on a naked flame on Shabbat, midirabanan, two reasons the Hachamim gave, the Rishonim give, either because you may come to stoke the fire, or either because it looks like cooking. For one of those two reasons, you cannot put even fully cooked foods, rabbinically, on a naked flame on Shabbat. But here, what you want to do is, you have another pot which is hot and it's covered. It's wrapped over with a towel, let's say. You're allowed to take this pot, which is how you want to keep it hot, and put it together with the other pot and cover it over. It's in order to retain its heat. That's what he's telling us here. And this is a chidush in hatmana, in the idea of insulation. We haven't learned hatmana yet, but the general idea is that you're not allowed to cover things fully on Shabbat, even with something which doesn't increase the heat. Okay, I'm not going to go into the details now because it's quite complex. It's a whole different topic. But here you are allowed to, because there is already something covered. There's a principle in Hatmana, there's something already covered, you can add something to it. So that's the idea here, is that I have a one pot wrapped over with a towel, and I've got another pot which is still hot. I can go and put that under the towel and wrap it up in order to retain its heat. Fine. That's relatively straightforward. ויכול לטוח פיו בבצק אם יש לו בצק שנילוש מאתמול. You can also put, if you don't have a lid, you didn't have lids in those days, so you can also cover the lid of the pot with dough. Okay, if the dough is not muktzeh. Okay, it's not so relevant. אבל אין מניחין כלי שיש בו דבר שאינו חם כל כך על גבי קדרה שהיא חמה כל כך שהעליון יכול להתחמם מחומה עד שתייצרז בו. But you cannot put this utensil on top of another utensil and wrap it over if the material, if the liquid inside it is not yat soledet bo. This is the Shulchan Aruch, as we've learned in Seif Daled earlier on, who holds that liquids are subject to further bishul. So therefore, even if it was boiled, but now it's no longer yat soledet bo, it's no longer that temperature, so you cannot put it on top of another pot where we may get yat soledet bo from that pot. Relatively straightforward. If, however, it's not possible for this to actually be yat soledet bo, even if you were to keep it there, then of course it's going to be mutar. This is only in a case where it's so hot, the bottom pot is so hot that it may become yat soledet bo. Then you can't put it on top because the liquid isn't boiling hot. But otherwise, it would be permissible to do. Okay. So in conclusion, what we're learning here is the same idea of bishul. There is bishul after bishul with the liquid, and therefore, if you have a pot with a liquid soup, which is still piping hot, you can put that on top of another boiling hot pot which is covered and use that same covering over it as well. That would be fine. If, however, the liquid inside it is no longer boiling hot, then you cannot put that on top of another pot. If by putting on top of the other pot there is the potential of the liquid in the top pot becoming yad soledet bo. If you just want to warm it up slightly, that would be fine. If it's not able to reach yad soledet bo, it's fine. This is important. We'll come to this maybe tonight, probably next week. You cannot put something in a place where it can be yad soledet bo, even if you intend to take it off before it becomes yad soledet bo. If, however, it's not possible to become Yatzelet, even if it's going to become warm, 30 degrees, to become lukewarm, that's fine. But if it's possible to reach Yatzelet Ba, then you can't put it there even if you intend to take it off before it becomes Yatzelet Ba. Okay, good. That's straightforward. Nothing major there. Okay, Sif Zayin and Chet are basically the same thing. Quite repetitive. Kli sheyesh bo davar ham shayat soledet bo. Basically, 7 is talking about liquid and 8 is talking about a solid, but it's the same idea. So a liquid, mutar, which is hot, mutar anicho beshabbat al kabei kedera hatmuna kedei shishmor huno v'lo yitztanen. Sorry, we did that. Sorry. Zain. יש מפרשים. דהה דשארי להניח כלי שיש בו דבר חם על גבי קדרה התמונה. Now we should like to put it on top. What we've just been talking about. אפילו כלי התחתון על האש. שרי. ויש מפרשים שהם כלי התחתון על האש לעולם אסור. Let me give a bit of background to understand this. Again, this is not really bishul, but it's mentioning it, so we'll quickly mention it. So on Shabbat, we said you can't put even fully cooked foods, even dry fully cooked foods, you cannot put on a naked flame on Shabbat. However, if it's garuf vekatum, if it's covered, you're allowed to keep boiling hot food on a naked flame on Shabbat. You cannot put, even if you have a very partial cover, you cannot put food there on Shabbat if it's a very small partial cover. It needs to be a proper separation. So the first opinion is saying, and this is how the halakha follows, that you can put, even if the bottom, we just explained in the previous seif, we were talking about putting one pot on top of another pot and wrapping it around. And even if the bottom pot is boiling hot, and that's fine because the liquid in the top pot is still hot, so you want to retain its heat. What we're saying here is that's even permissible if the bottom pot is on the fire. I'm putting something on the fire on Shabbat. So we're saying that since there is the pot in between, that's considered a hefsek. That's even better than garuf katum. Garuf katum is you've taken the ashes out. Here you have an actual pot. That's a clear separation. That's a clear indication that you won't come to cook and you won't come to stoke. And therefore, the first opinion, יש מפרשים, דהה דשאר להניח כלי שיש בו דבר חם לגבי גדר התמונה, אפילו כלי תחתון על אש הרי. Even if the bottom pot is on the fire, you can still put the top pot on top of it, because that pot in between acts as a clear hefsek and a clear indication, and it's better than garuf katum, and therefore you can put things on there on Shabbat. ויש מפרשים שאם כלי התחתון על האש לעולם אסור, but the other opinion says, no, you can't, because it's got the same status as you've just put a partial cover on, which you can't put things on for the first time on Shabbat. You can only keep things on the flame from before Shabbat, but you can't put things on. In the next halakha, Shulchan is going to say exactly the same and say the halakha follows the first opinion. So even though we explained at length last week that normally when there are two opinions, halakha follows the second one, but here the Shulchan clearly says the halakha follows the first one. So look at Chet, same idea. Here just 7 was talking about liquids and 8 is talking about solids. להניח דבר קר שנתבשל כל צורכו על גבי מחם של האש, to put dry solids on on top of an urn which is on the fire. So let's say putting on top of an urn, we'll talk about. Yeah, יש אומרים שדינו כמן חוק מקדם מדורה. Some say it's like putting it away from the fire. וכל דבר שמוטל לנחוק נמורה במקום שזה בו, כגון שיבש, מוטל לנחוק גבי מחם, שגבי האש. And therefore, just like you're allowed to put things away from the fire, for example, you're allowed to put things by a fireplace, not in the fireplace, but outside the fireplace, you're allowed to, because that's not if it's cooked, because that doesn't look like cooking. People are not going to come to that's not mehazekim bashel. So just like you can do that, you can also put it on top of another pot. It's the same idea. ויש אומרים דהווה קמיח על גבי קירה לכתחילה ואסור אפילו לשל כל צורכו. Second opinion is that no, it's putting on top is still it's on the fire even though there's a pot in between. ואפילו מצלק ורו ואפילו אותו שם לשמור חומו, even just to keep the heat. ויראשון נראה עיקר. The first opinion is the correct one. ומכל מקום מתפשיש יש בו רוטב מצטמק ואפילו אסור דברי הכל. If it's called liquid, then it's going to be forbidden. To summarize, exactly the same things in Siv Zayin and Siv Het. What we're saying here is as follows. To summarize, that's the end of this minor topic, these three Seifim. In short, what we've learned is that you are allowed to take a pot which has boiling hot liquid in it, or a pot which has dry solids in it, and put it on top of another pot, and cover it over with the initial covering which was on the first pot, and cover it over, and there won't be a problem of hatmana. That's one point. Second point is, you can even put the pot on top of the pot with the covering, even if the pot underneath is on the fire itself. Because the main opinion, the first opinion, which the Shulchan Aruch rules like, is that because there is a pot in between, that acts as a clear heker, a clear indication that this is not a regular way of cooking, you won't come to stoke, and therefore this is better than regular garuf v'katum, and therefore you are allowed to put that on the other pot on the fire. And therefore, the practical application of this is, you are allowed to put things which are fully cooked on an urn on Shabbat. This is similar idea, because the urn, in a sense, is like water on the fire. You've got one pot, the urn, and you've got the element there at the bottom, which is the fire. So it's like putting another pot on top of the urn is exactly what we're talking about. So what we're saying is, even if we consider, which we don't actually, the element in the urn is not considered a naked flame. Yeah, so therefore that's but even if we were to consider it that, you could still put food on top of the urn to heat, even if it can reach Yad Soledet, but if it's a solid. If it's a liquid, then you can't. So from my experience, I don't think that putting cold liquids on top of an urn, I don't know if anyone disagrees with this or your experience has been different. I don't think that putting on top of the urn, the plastic urn which we have, actually, I'm just thinking now, you got these metal urns, right? I don't know if the lid is plastic or metal, but think of the white plastic urns. That's the urn I'm envisioning in my head. I don't think that putting cold liquids on that can reach Yad Soledet bar. And therefore, anyone disagree with that? Is that correct? Yeah, I don't think it can. That's my, and therefore, if that's the case, you can even put cold liquids on there. And that's often, what happens is people put cold liquids on there to warm up and that's fine, because as we've explained, if it's not able to reach Yad Soledet bar, then it's fine to put it on to warm up because it's already cooked, or solids you can put on there freely, of course. I'm just thinking about the metal urns, perhaps there, through insulation of the metal on top, perhaps there can reach Yad Soledet bar. If that's the case, then you have to make sure it's dry solid or boiling hot liquid to put on top. Okay, but that putting on top of a kettle of an urn would be basically what we're saying here in these three seifim. Okay, good. Moving on now to Seif Tet. So this is in the Gemara. So far, what have we said? We've said Kli Rishon cooks. And let's just see that inside. Seif Tet, the beginning. Kli Rishon, אפילו לאחר שהעבירו מעל האש, מבשל כל זמן שהיד סולדת בו, לפיכך אסור ליתן לתוכו תבלין, full stop. So, a Kli Rishon, which doesn't have to be on the fire. Kli Rishon is the pot where you cooked something in, even if you've moved it off the fire. So think of a pot of soup, and you've taken it off the hot plate. You've taken it off the fire just before Shabbat, and it's boiling hot. And that can stay boiling hot for a good half an hour if you keep the lid closed, even more maybe. Yeah. That is called a Kli Rishon, and that has the ability to cook as long as that's readable, and therefore you can't put spices in there. And for that matter, you can't put anything in it. Okay, good. That we've learned. We've also learned that Meikar Hadin Kli Sheni no mevashel. According to Sfaradim, Kli Sheni can't cook the vast majority of things. Even for Ashkenazim, they don't put things in the Kli Sheni for different reasons, but in principle they agree that Kli Sheni does not cook most things, aside from the Kalei Bishul, which we discussed. The Gemara discusses salt. Very interesting. I don't know. It's just talking about salt. I don't know why salt. There are two lishnot. The first lishnah, the first version, it's a statement of Rabbi Nachman trying to understand what he said. The first statement is that salt is so hard to cook, like the meat of an ox, that you can put it in a Kli Rishon. Exception. Salt, we've talked about Kalei HaBishul, there's Kashei HaBishul. There are some things which are very hard to cook. What's clear, and this is agreed by everyone, by the way, the meat of an ox cannot be cooked in a Kli Sheni and cannot be cooked in a Kli Rishon, which is off the fire. Okay? So that's a riddle. Many people don't realize this. People think Kli Rishon cooks everything. Kli Rishon on the fire cooks everything. Kli Rishon off the fire, the Gemara says clearly, and it's agreed by all, the meat of an ox cannot be cooked on a Kli Rishon off the fire. And therefore, if we ever had a bizarre scenario where you had a very strong meat, you could put that in it wouldn't cook. So fine. The Gemara says that in the first version, the Gemara says the salt is not like that, and salt is like everything else. In the second version, it says the salt is like the meat of an ox, and therefore it can be put in a Kli Rishon. Now, when learning Gemara, you should know when you have two versions, some say this, some say that. Generally speaking, the halacha follows the Lishna Batra, the second version. And that's how the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh are all posek like the second version, that salt has the same status as very hard meat, and therefore salt can be put in a Kli Rishon off the fire. You can never put something on the fire on Shabbat. Never. Off the fire, you can put this strong meat, and you can even put salt. Says the Shulchan Aruch, "Aval melach mutar liten letocho kevan she'aviro me'al ha'esh." But salt you can put into the meat once you've taken it into the pot, once you've taken it off the fire. The tzricha milha bishula kebisra de Torah, because according to the second opinion, salt needs cooking like very hard meat. Okay, full stop. Let's stop there. So that's the opinion of Shulchan Aruch. That's the main opinion. Tosfot says that perhaps the halacha follows the first opinion. He gives some reasons there why he wants to argue that. And he says, "Hamahmir tavo alav bracha." Tosfot says, "Hamahmir tavo alav bracha." Interesting. Which is, yeah. So the Rama brings this. The Rama brings this opinion. Let's skip out the Yesh Mishoser. We'll come back to that in a second. V'yesh, come see here. V'yesh osrim latet melach afilu b'kli sheni kol zeman she'at zoredet bo v'mahmir tavo alav bracha. The Tosfot says the first version, I forgot to say this, the first version says the other extreme. Not only is salt not like meat, but it's actually more tender than everything else. It's kalea bishul. Okay, Tosfot says we should follow that. It's good to be mahmir like that opinion. Okay, so basically there's a mahloket here in mitziyut, in reality. What's the status of salt? Is salt something which is easy and tender, or is it something very hard to cook? I tried to look online to see if there's any scientific. I didn't really find much. But look, we follow the Shulchan Aruch, and therefore you should know you are allowed to put salt into anything. According to Sfaradim, you can put salt into anything which is not on the fire. Even if it's piping hot, even if it's a kli rishon, you can put salt in it. The Ramah says the Ashkenazim should try to be mahmir not to put salt even in a kli sheni, because maybe salt is kalea bishur and it's the complete opposite of the ox meat. Okay, so that's what we should know. Salt is permissible. The Shulchan just brings another opinion here, which is it's in the first opinion. Some said that although meat can't be cooked, ox meat, but the liquid in it can be cooked, and therefore you can't. Okay, let's not follow this. The main halakha is the first one. Fine. To summarize, there are two opinions in the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, based on the two opinions in the Gemara and two opinions in the Rishonim. The main halacha, even for Ashkenazim, is that you're allowed to put salt in a kli rishon, but it's good for Ashkenazim to be stringent, not to put salt in a kli sheni even. And strictly speaking, you can put meat in a kli rishon, which is very hard meat, you can put in a kli rishon, which is off the fire, although some would say that the meat's fine, but the liquid inside it isn't fine, which is difficult to understand. Okay. Finishes off the Rema. Vim avar venatan melach afilu bikli rishon afilu hu ala esh avad isura mutar ha'ma'achal da melach batel al gabeh ha'ma'achal. Says if you did transgress and put salt even in the kli rishon, even on the fire, you can still have the food. Why can you have the food? Because the salt is nullified vis-a-vis the rest of the food. Salt is going to be less than a 60th, hopefully, unless you're very unhealthy. The salt is going to be less than a 60th of the food there. Okay? So even if you put salt in the pot of soup, on the hot plate, on the fire, on the naked flame even, that would still be permissible to have the food because the salt would be nullified in the food. Are there any questions on this? Any questions on this seif, or any questions on anything which we've learned? So the big question discussed here is you have a principle in Hilchot Kashrut that something which is avid leta'ama, something which is put in to give taste, lo batel. This is the problem when it comes to, let's say, sweets, or davar ma'amid, or davar hashuv, right? You know, sometimes people say you can't have sweets because of there's beetle juice in them and stuff, right? And that's an issue. But there's a number of points there. But let's assume that's the issue. But what's the problem? It's a tiny amount, and it's most time less than 60th. The answer is they put it in for coloring. Because they put it in for coloring, that's not batel. Even if it's 1 in 1,000, it doesn't become nullified. Something which is put in for taste, even if it's less than a 60th, even if it's more than 60th, it's still, well, less than 60, yeah. It's still not batel. So how can the Ramah say that if you put salt in, it's batel, it's nullified, and you can eat the food? Why don't we say it's not nullified, it's put there for taste, and since it's not nullified, you can't have the whole dish. You're going to have to follow the principles we learned in Seif Aleph. You have to wait. Intentional, non-intentional, Shabbat, after Shabbat, and so on and so forth. So Acharonim are very perplexed by this, and they have to resort to say that we must be talking about a situation in which it was already salted partially before Shabbat. And the principle of zeh v'zeh gorem, meaning it's a combination. True, if it wasn't salted at all, and you put the salt in and it salted it, that would be a problem. And you would have to assume there's an issue there, and you'd have to wait. until you'd have to wait until after Shabbat. But here we're talking about where you already put in, and therefore it's ואף אגב דמי דוד דתם רבתי שני יחדיו וזהו וזהו גורם. כך מה יש למנחה גם כן מקרא בערב שבת. גם דמי שניתן עכשיו לא וכדי לתנתם בגלל זולת המי של אתמול. אם המי של עכשיו לא. Okay, so that's difficult. It's quite, yeah, it doesn't, but in short, if you were to put salt or spices for that matter in soup on the fire on Shabbat, you would have to make an assessment. Firstly, was this spiced and salted before Shabbat? And would that have been edible in and of itself? And you know, yeah, if that's the case, that's fine. You can eat the food. If, however, it wasn't salted and spiced for Shabbat, you put spice in, now you made the soup much more tasty, much more salty, and you put it in. Then, if you did that intentionally, you would not be able to have that soup till after Shabbat, and you yourself never have that soup if you did intentionally, like the principles we learned in Sif Aleph. So that's with regards to salt. Good. Continues the Shulchan Aruch. This we've touched on already. Asur, you see Yud. Asur liten tavlin ba'ke'ara ularot alehem mikli rishon. It's forbidden to put anything. Talks about spices just because he's talking about that before, but it's anything. It's forbidden to put anything in a cup and pour on it from a kli rishon. This is what we've been talking about all the time. This whole siman, irui kli rishon, pouring from a kli rishon. We have said that it is a mahloket rishonim between the Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam. Rashbam allowed it. Rabbeinu Tam did not allow it. And we follow Rabbeinu Tam. Shulchan Aruch follows Rabbeinu Tam that it's forbidden to do irui kli rishon. And that's the halacha, and that's what we've taken all the time. And that's why when we learned Seif Daled, it was quite difficult to understand it because of this. We talked about it at the time. But in principle, in short here, what we've seen here is Kli Rishon cooks, even off the fire, aside from salt and aside from very hard meat. And Irui Kli Rishon also is forbidden from the Torah. It's forbidden from the Torah. We have a mahloket both. According to Rabbeinu Tam, it's forbidden from the Torah. According to Rashbam, it's mutar. But even according to Rabbeinu Tam, it only cooks. It's forbidden, but it can only cook up to a peel, and it makes a difference for Shabbat. When Shabbat you cooked anything, it's asur. But for kashrut, it'll make a difference. For kashrut, it'll only forbid the outer peel, but not more than that. Okay, good. Yud Aleph and Yud Bet we're going to do next week. This is the principle of: do we have an idea that the bottom overpowers the top? If you mix two things together, does the bottom overpower the top? It's quite a complex topic. There are some practical points from it, so we'll do that with Hashem next time. Let's do the smaller Seifim first, because that needs a whole explanation. Seif Yud Gimel. מותר ליתן קיתון של מים או של שאר משקים בכלי שני שיש בו מים חמין, אבל בכלי ראשון אסור. He's quoting this because it's explicit. This is an explicit example in the Gemara. You're allowed to put a bottle of water or anything else in a kli sheni with boiling hot water, but in a kli rishon it's forbidden. Now, why? Because the Gemara says on this because kli sheni no mevashel. So if kli sheni mevashel, why talk about a bottle of water? Talk about water itself. So here the Gemara says, because to tell you that in a kli rishon, even a kiton, even in a bottle would be forbidden, because if you put a small amount of cold water in a bottle in a kli rishon, even if it's off the fire, it will have the ability to be able to cook the water to reach out Soledet bo. And therefore, it's telling you that even water in a bottle, you cannot put in a kli rishon, even if it's off the fire, but you can put that in a kli sheni, either with a bottle or without the bottle, even the pure water itself. You could put that in the kli rishon. Now we never discussed why is it that kli sheni is allowed. I don't think I ever discussed this, and we should, because kli sheni is, even if it's piping hot, even if it's 80, 90 degrees, you moved it again. What's kli sheni? Let's just picture it. Yeah, you have an urn. Boiling hot water in there, literally. When you say boiling hot, I mean boiling hot water. It's boiling. And you pour it into a cup. How much temperature, how many degrees did that go down from the second you poured from the urn into the cup? A degree, 2 degrees, three, I don't know how many. It'd be interesting to measure to do it, but it's still boiling hot. It can scald a child 100%. If that water in the cup now falls immediately on a child's stomach, it will burn him. And yet, klisheni you can put in there. We've learned, for us, certainly, klisheni doesn't cook. You can put in there anything. Why? Tosfot asks the question, and Tosfot answers that, true, it's still hot, but an element of cooking is also the walls of the pot. So you have a pot, you got the fire giving the heat, but that also warms up the walls, and the walls add to the cooking ability of the pot. Once it's been transferred to a second pot, although it's still piping hot, it doesn't have the walls to be able to cook because those weren't heated up by the fire. Only the kli rishon, which was on the fire, the fire heated up the walls, so that those walls cook. When it's moved to kli sheni, it no longer is the case, and therefore that's permissible. That's the only explanation I've seen of the difference between kli rishon and kli sheni. Scientifically, I don't think there's much to that. But this is a halachic understanding that it's no longer it's no longer kli rishon, it's a kli sheni, and therefore it's permissible. That's how we take on, despite the fact that it's still boiling hot. That once it's a kli sheni, because it's no longer got the walls heated by the fire itself, it's permissible to put things, vast majority of things in it. Yeah, Robert.
Just a question. If you put something in a Kli Rishon and the water hasn't yet risen to Yad Soledet, 25 degrees, 30 degrees, right? And I don't know, for whatever reason you put something in, what's the status here? Let's say you realize and you take it off the fire. Have you actually done an avera? Has it cooked? Because
Oh, you
I
mean you
think
put
you
something on the fire?
no, you had something on the fire, but it hadn't yet reached Yad Soledet. You put it on maybe from before Shabbat, hadn't yet reached Yad Soledet. And
Uncooked.
then and then
Uncooked.
uh, I'm saying, let's say a pot of water, right? Say a
Yeah,
pot
but
of
it's never
water,
never
right?
been boiled before.
Never been boiled before.
Okay.
And
So
then you
let's
drop something into it.
okay.
And so my assumption is you need both factors. You need the water to be above Yad Soledet, and you also need to be a Kli Rishon, and you've only got one of the two factors.
Obviously, klisheni doesn't cook. Obviously, it has to be klishon.
No, but I'm saying it isn't a Kli Rishon because it's on the fire, but the water's not Yad Soledet yet. So how have you cooked whatever it is, a piece
Okay,
of meat
it's a
you
good
dropped
point.
in?
So let's talk about solids. Good question to discuss with regards to solids. Okay, well, liquid's a bit more difficult, but let's discuss solids for a moment. If I put raw food, raw chicken, on the fire in a pot, literally, on the fire. Yeah, the fire is on already, so I haven't done igniting. Yeah, I put it on. Yeah, and then I did teshuvah 5 minutes later, and I took it off. It hasn't even reached 1/3 cooked. It's completely inedible. Have you transgressed any sur? No, you haven't. It's wrong to do what you've done, but you haven't transgressed any sur. You haven't transgressed a sur from the Torah. You've transgressed a rabbinic isur for sure, because you're never allowed to. We're going to learn this next seif or the seif after. You're never allowed to leave something in a place where it can reach out to edible, even if you intend to take it off. So rabbinically, you've definitely done something wrong. Have you done a biblical prohibition? No, you haven't, and I've got no, you haven't, and there's a proof I just saw today on it on that. You haven't, because if it hasn't reached Ma'achal ben Drusai, you haven't. If it's reached Ma'achal ben Drusai, you've definitely violated an isur from the Torah. Okay, the question which we discussed a few weeks ago was if it was cooked Ma'achal ben Drusai before Shabbat, then I went from Ma'achal ben Drusai till the end. Is that Doraita, is a Draban, is that Mutar? It's what Mahloket Rishonim in that. Okay, and we hold it's Doraita, it's forbidden. But the point is, to answer your question specifically, you will not have committed an Isur Doraita. It's wrong what you've done, but you will not commit Doraita if you took it off. And therefore, certainly, if a person put it on and then realize he's done something, he should take it off before he's Macham Dosai, and at least he'll have rectified the Isur Doraita. Now, with liquids, there's a question: what is Ma'achal ben Drusai? Yeah, is there a concept of Ma'achal ben Drusai with liquids? I'm not holding it in now. I haven't looked at it recently, but I remember there's a big discussion with it, which is Do we say that half of Yad Soledet Bo, or one third of Yad, so let's say Yad Soledet Bo is 45 degrees, okay? Let's say, like we said at the beginning. So what? So what's Machal Bedusa? Is that 15 degrees? Right? So that's a question. There's a big discussion about it. I don't remember exactly what the views are. Some say there's no Machal Bedusa with liquids. It's only with food, not with liquids. Okay, but that's the idea. If it's the point is if you've begun, if it hasn't yet reached, you should take it off before it gets worse. Okay, next halacha, Yudalad. מותר ליתן קיתון של מים או של שאר משקים כנגד האש להפיק צינתן, ובלבד שיתנם רחוק מהאש, בעניין שאינו יכול להתחמם באותו מקום עד שתהיה יד סולדת בו. דהיינו שקריסו של תינוק נכווית בו, full stop. אבל אסור לקובו אל האש למקום שיכול להתחמם שתהיה יד סולדת בו. ואפילו יניח בו שעה קטנה שתפיק צינתן אסור. כיוון שיכול להתבשל לשם. This is what I've been saying this evening. This is clear from the Gemara, accepted by all, that you cannot put things near. So firstly, there are two aspects here. Let's just step back a second. Firstly, as we've said, rabbinically, you can't put things on the fire on Shabbat. Putting things next to the fireplace is permissible. Because again, what's the reason you can't put things on the fire? Either you'll come to cook or you'll come to stoke, right? But putting it next to the fireplace, so think of a fireplace, a chimney, a fireplace, think of that. You can't put it in, but next to it, you can put it. And you're not going to come to stoke or to cook, and that's fine from the perspective of the rabbinic prohibition of putting things. But it may heat it up so hot, it can reach Yad Soledet Bo. So the answer is, if it's something if it's solids which are already cooked, of course you can do that. Why not? But if it's something which is not like liquid, which is not boiled or liquid which have cooled down, you can't put it so close to the fire that if it was to stay by the fire, it could reach in half an hour, it could reach Yad Soledet Bo. Even if I intend to come in 10 minutes time to take it away, you can't do that. Even if I just want to warm it up, but it can reach Yad Soledet Bo. You can't because we schedule, forget, you'll leave it there, etc. If, however, you're putting it far enough that it's not able to reach Yad Soledet, even if you leave it there for a few hours, you can leave it there even if it gets warm, even if it gets to 30 degrees, lukewarm, it's still permissible to do because it's not possible to reach Yad Soledet, and therefore that becomes mutar. So that's the principle, that you can't leave anything which is possible to reach Yad Soledet. That's only something, by the way, which you would like, which is good for you if it gets hot and gets boiled. Right? Meaning there's no problem leaving stuff like material. Maybe we'll learn at the end of the Siman. Bishul also applies to certain materials. For example, melting wax and other things and making things red hot. It's not really discussed in Shulchan Aruch, it's discussed in the Rambam. But these kinds of things are also subject to bishul. That you can leave as long as it doesn't reach out to the because you don't, because that's going to be it's going to get burnt. It's going to be bad if that happens. You're not going to forget that. Only something like food where it's good, it gets cooked. Then we're concerned, and if we can't leave it near to the fire. And the Rama adds in, even things which are already edible, like fruit, just like waters can be drunk already, but still, also fruit as well. It's subject to bishul because by cooking it, it gets better. It's subject to bishul, and therefore you cannot leave them in a place near enough to reach Yad Soledet Bo. To reach Yad Soledet Bo, you can't leave it there in a place where you can reach Yad Soledet Bo. Yeah, the Shara Tziyun discuss, for example, a towel, by the way. You can leave a dry towel on the radiator, even if it reaches boiling hot. You have to load it, but that's going to be quite hard for that to happen. But you can do that because we're not concerned you're going to leave it there and it's going to reach there because you don't want it to burn and to get so hot. But obviously, you can't leave a towel with liquid in it on the radiator. That would be both bishul and mav'ir. Sorry, that would be bishul and kibbutz as well. Okay, fine. The Shara Tziyun discusses whether cooking something which is already completely edible, like fruit, is forbidden from the Torah from the Midrabanan. Okay, it's most likely it's a from the Torah. Okay, final halacha we'll learn this evening, and we come. Okay, so this is again something we've learned already. Davar shnitbashel kol tzorko v'hu yavesh en bo barak. Same idea. Something which is a liquid, something which is a solid and it's fully cooked. Mutar laniho keneged hamedura. You can leave it by the fireplace. Afilu b'makom she'at soledet bo. Even if it can reach yad soledet bo, because it's fully cooked and it's a solid, you can leave it there by the fireplace. So there's no problem of bishul because it's fully cooked. And there's no problem of shehiyah, of leaving things on the fire, because it's next to the fireplace. It's not on the fireplace. It's next to it. And even though it can reach out to it's fine to do that. So if you're in the countryside, you've taken a holiday house, and you've got a chimney, you've got a fire roaring down Friday night, you can go and put your chicken and your schnitzel next to it, and it can heat up, and that would be fine because it's cooked. But not if it would be a liquid which is cooled down. And even if it's cooled down already, you can, because solids are not subject to further bishul. אבל אם הוא רותח, if it's liquid, אבל אם הוא רותח בדבר שיש במרק, מותר. אבל אם הוא רותח, אפילו בדבר שיש במרק, מותר. Right. And if it's a liquid, it has to be boiling hot to put it has to be yad soledet bo to put it by the fire. And this is the famous Ramah, which we learned in Sif Daled, ויש מקילין לומר דכל שאינו נותנו על גבי האש או הכירה ממש רק סמוך אפילו נצטנן מותר. Even if it's there's no bishul achar bishul with liquids, ונהגו להקל בזה אם לא נצטנן לגמרי כמו שכתבתי לאל. And it says the minhag of the Ashkenazim is to be lenient, to say that if something is still lukewarm, it's no longer subject to bishul if it's still lukewarm. We discussed at the time what's the reason for this, what kind of compromise this is. We discussed that at the time. Okay. So many small things we've learned this evening. No major chidushim this evening. One final thing I should say, which was mentioned in the Mishnah Berurah. So just what do we need to still do? We need to learn next week, B'ezrat Hashem, Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, which is the whole concept of hot and cold mixing together, which one overpowers the other. Then we need to see the final three Seifim. This is an important one, Ted Zayin, which talks about congealed solids turning into liquids and vice versa, and melting stuff on Shabbat. Okay, and then Yudchet is another important one about stirring pots. That's a very important point people don't know. I've seen people do this. People who keep Shabbat and they're knowledgeable and be sure, but they don't realize there are some things you can't do on the fire, such as stirring, and we'll discuss that B'ezrat Hashem. And then we'll finish the Siman. Yeah, probably we'll need another week or two to do that. The one thing I should say is in the context of one of the earlier Seifim, it was in the context of Sif Tet, I think. The Mishnah Berurah brings the Maharshal, when we're talking about Kli Sheni, who says this Hidush of Davar Gush. This is the Hidush of the Maharshal. It's not found in the Rishonim. That, although we say Kli Sheni and Om Vashel, okay, Ashkenazim are strict Kli Shelishi, fine, okay. That only applies to liquids. Because liquid, and there's a scientific background to that, in the sense that the particles move around in liquids. So by transferring it from one utensil to the next, the temperature is decreasing. But a solid, moving it from one to the other, doesn't change its status. Which means a boiling hot potato, for example. You take it off the hot plate, Kli Rishon. Put in your plate, we would say Kli Sheni. For us, you can put your salt on it, you can put your spices on it. Okay, Ashkenazim would say, fine, move it to a third utensil, then put your spices and stuff in. No. Says Masha Mishnah Berurah is mahmir like this, and many of the Ashkenazim are strict like this, is that no, if it's a davar gush, something like a potato, which has got heat really retained in it, however many utensils you pass it on to, it doesn't make a difference. It still retains its status. Only liquids where the particles move in it, then it retains, but otherwise it doesn't. So we Sfaradim never took this on. We don't have that, but you should know. That's why some Ashkenazim will not put anything on potatoes. I remember in Yeshiva, they wouldn't put anything on potatoes until it wasn't hot anymore. Have to wait till it's yeah. But that's the concept of the vargush when it comes to Hilchot Shabbat. So Hashem, next week, same time, 6:30. And we'll try to finish the Siman of Bishul and then move on. Any questions?